Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Loseneziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. And we're continuing with the 82nd chessanity tournament that took place in Jericho, New York, that is in the middle of Long Island, on September 7th. In round one, if you see the previous video, I started with a win. Unfortunately, the web page explaining the rules of the tournament has been taken down since the tournament has been completed. So I'm going to briefly discuss the situation. There were three sections. The quads, where I participated, the under 600, where players with ratings below 600 were eligible, and the development for players that did not want their games to be rated. In the quads, players divided into groups of 4 based on their ratings. The top 4 players were in quad A, the next 4 were in quad B, the next 4 in quad C, and so on. In every quad group, every player had to face the other 3 ones, and the time control was 45 minutes with 5 seconds delay. This meant that every player, when it was their time to play, for the first 5 seconds, the clock would not go down. The time would start at 45 minutes for each of them. When it was their turn, for the first 5 seconds, the clock would not move, and then it would start going down, and they would have to complete all their moves before the clock went down to 0. For round number 2, my opponent, his name is Evan Su Yuan, and his rating, that is of course before the tournament, was 1453, and he belonged to the 81.6 percentile, meaning that from each 100 players of the United States Chess Federation, he was better than 81.6 of them. Compare this with my numbers. My rating, and of course this was with the the New York State Championship not counting, had not been officially processed. My rating was 1582. After the New York State Championship, it had been raised to 1614. And I belong to 85.9. So even without counting the New York State Championship, I had much better rating and I was a favorite. But we're going to see what actually happened in the game. This is the analysis board of chess.com. And on the left half, you're going to see the situation on the board. I'm going to enter every move from the scoreboard as it was taking place. On the right half below the word analysis, you'll see the computer evaluation with a positive number meaning white is better and a negative meaning that black is better. Was the move played the best or not? If not, which should have been the best move? And what are the best 3 options for the other player whose turn is to come? When we're starting the game, Evan had the white pieces, I had the black. First 3 moves, French defense. Knight to d2, the option for white, and my pawn goes to c5. Until now, this theory, you see, it's called book move, and this is a symbol of a book, which means there is no literal book. Of course, what it means is there is a database of the openings, what are the most popular and most important moves for the opening. Move number 4, white abandons the so-called book, sends his pawn to c3. Inaccuracies, the computer would rather have the d4 pawn being protected by the knight from g1 to f3, because then white would develop a piece. Now they don't. My knight goes to c6. Knight goes to e2, and we're fighting for the d4 pawn, for the d4 square, in fact. My queen goes to b6. And the pawn at d4 is attacked 3 times by me and defended only twice. It's attacked by my knight, my queen, and my pawn, defended by the pawn and the knight. If white decides to take the pawn, my bishop takes the pawn, and then the pawn on f2 is in danger. And if white is even more careless, then it could even be a checkmate. So white would have to move The bishop cannot move. One of the knights clearly would have to move to avoid checkmate, but their position would be very, very bad. That is why instead they move their knight from d2 to b3, so the pawn at d4 is defended 4 times. Attack 3, defended 4. He's attacked by queen, pawn, and knight, defended by the 2 knights, the pawn c3, and the queen on d1. I take the d4 pawn. Evan takes the d5 pawn. I take back on d5. And by doing so, there is one good and one bad thing in my position. The good thing is that my bishop on c8 is much freer before. It can go to quite a lot of squares, while before it could only go until d7. The bad thing for me is that my d5 pawn is isolated, meaning no pawns on the c or e file to defend it. If it's attacked, it must be defended by one of my pieces, which means that my piece cannot do something else. For example, attack the opponent. Evan is going to take the pawn on d4. There are 4 ways to take it, and Evan decides to take it with the c pawn, which makes the d4 pawn now isolated. Had they taken it with any of the knights, or even with the queen, they would not have to face this issue. And in my case, when I created the isolated pawn, at least I gave myself an advantage with the c8 pawn not being blocked any longer. In fact, there's a term, this is called the French bishop, the bishop that is blocked. I check with my bishop and develop my bishop at the same time, goes to b4 and checks, so I check with tempo. White replies by placing their bishop on d2, and I decide not to initiate the exchange of the bishops. Usually, if 2 pieces stare at each other and either one can initiate the exchange, it's better if you don't initiate it because you can do something else. Assuming, of course, you don't lose material by doing so. What I decide to do is develop my knight, go to f6. And at this point, Evan decides to exchange the bishops. Knight goes to c3, blocks it. I castle, king size, the only size I could castle. Bishop is developed and goes to d3. Computer thinks a mistake. The reason why is because now I have the option. My best move is to move my rook on e8 and check. Had the bishop been, and then white, of course, would have to move again the bishop or do something else. Had white kept the bishop on e2, yes, it would be pinned if I move my rook, but at least I wouldn't need to spend another move to answer the check. But myself, I miss it. Instead, I send my bishop to g4. Attacking the queen, and of course the knight protects the bishop, so white cannot just take my bishop. Queen goes to d2. Computer thinks a miss and gives me an advantage, 1.52. And now I'm checking. And white decides that their best option is not to block it, but to move the king to f1. In fact, the computer agrees with that. My rook goes to e7, hoping to double my rooks along the e file. White attacks my bishop, sends the pawn to f3. My bishop goes to h5. King goes to f2, initiating what's called the castling backhand, meaning eventually they'll put the king on g1 and the rook on f1. By moving the king to f2, at least the rook at h1 has more freedom than before. They can move along the entire first rank. The bishop goes to g6. I didn't like my bishop having almost nowhere to go on h5, and now I'm proposing change of bishops. White initiates it, and you may think they're not doing well. The computer thinks it's not the best move, but still it's a good move because at least they are creating a double pawn along the g file. I have double pawns. It's not the best outcome for me, but it's not a disaster because they are not isolated. There is a pawn f7 next to them. Before they were forming one pawn island, now one pawn island, so not too much is lost. Rook goes to f1 to continue the castling by hand. My rook goes to e8 to double the rooks along the e file. King goes to g1 and completes the castling by hand. You'll see king g1, rook f1 as if white had castled, but instead of doing it in one castling move, they do it in, let's see, 3 or 4 moves. In 3 moves they did. King to f2, rook to f1, king to g1. My queen goes to c4 to exert control along the diagonal from a6 to f1. White places the rook on c1. I have to be careful because if this knight moves anywhere, my queen is in danger. And if it moves with a threat, I'll have 2 threats simultaneously. To avoid such a scenario, my queen goes to a... Now, look, of course, now this is not possible, but if I continue having my queen on c4 and the knight on c3, at some point it could become possible. And usually when you least expect it. And that is why my queen goes to a6. But white threatens my queen by sending the knight to c5, and my queen goes to b6. Evan places his rook on d1 on the same file with the queen. And my rook goes to c8 to exert pressure along the c file. And white realizes that the pawn b2 is defended only by the queen. It's attacked by my queen and doesn't want to keep the queen forever just to defend the pawn. That's why pushes the pawn to b3. And I push my pawn to a6. Why? I don't want the knight to be able to come to b5. Of course, currently, if they do it, they lose the knight from the queen, but I don't want my queen to stay there forever just to avoid the knight going to b5 and then creating threats on my side of the board. And white decides to start attacking along the king's side. Queen goes to g5. The computer thinks it is a blunder. This gives me a combination that eventually gave me a pawn. And we'll follow the combination. Knight takes on d4. Rook takes on. This is a great move because my knight will be lost, but by giving its quote-unquote life, I win the pawn because rook takes a knight, but my other rook takes the knight on c5, and I completed the combination, and I'm a pawn ahead. And the computer thinks that my real advantage is even larger, 3.96. And both moves of my combination were accounted as great moves. White regretted sending the queen to g5, sends it back to d2. My rook goes to c6 to have more space to go. Mistakes as a computer would rather have the other rook go to c7 and attack the knight on c3. King goes to f2. White regrets perhaps sending the king to g1 because it's far from the action. My other rook goes to c7 and I am doubling my rooks on the c file, attacking the knight on c3 twice, defended twice. And if I can win the knight, wonderful. Otherwise, at least I'm constraining the white pieces. King goes to e1 to be near the action. And my queen goes to a5. Now my advantage becomes 4.5. As you see, it's quite significant. The knight is attacked 3 times by my 2 rooks and the queen, currently defended twice by queen and rook, so white needs to do something for that. What they do is the rook goes to d3. By doing so, the knight is defended 3 times, but barely. If I continue the pressure, I might win it. That is why the computer thinks my best move would be to push the pawn to d4. I'm not sure if I'm winning material. Of course, the knight needs to go to e2 no matter what. Otherwise, really, my rook wins the rook because the queen is pinned and you not take it back. If it goes to e2, at least if I take the rook, then I can take it back. I might do something different. I might, for example, place my rook on e7 to pin the knight. The situation looks good for me. But I decide to check from e6. King goes to f2. So white king goes back and forth between e1, f2, and g1. My other rook goes to e7 to double my rooks along the e file. We finish 30 moves. The computer doesn't like it. I have a small advantage of 0.95. And now white plays a move that the computer thinks it's a blunder. They're down a pawn, so they decide to take my pawn on d5. The computer thinks a big blunder of 4.67. It seems I'm going to win, but at this time I did something completely inexcusable. I have no excuse for that. I'm going to admit it openly, something we should never do. I had about a little bit more than 10 minutes to the clock. My opponent was down in the last minute. So what I did is I was staring at my opponent's clock, looking the seconds going down, waiting for the moment that the clock would go down to 0, and I would announce win because my opponent would run out of time. And I was so much focused on the clock that I was not focused on the board. And I did perhaps the worst move I could have done. I took my opponent's knight. And you see that my 4.93 advantage becomes 4.96 for my opponent. But my opponent, because my opponent can grab the queen, but instead of grabbing it, and by the way, at this point, my opponent was just down in the last second, but they had the 5 seconds delay. Without the delay, I would have won the game because of time. So my opponent, who had before was letting the time run loose, now was really very much focused and starts his combination. Instead of directly taking the queen, rook goes to c8 check, my rook goes to e8, exchange the rooks. Still, I had not realized what had happened, believe it or not, and then finally I see my opponent grabbing my queen on a5. I was shocked. I lost my sense of control. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't believe it. My opponent had 1 second in the clock, but with a 5-second delay, they were very focused and he was going to play all his moves in the 5 seconds and still have 1 second in his clock. See what can do. My knight goes to f6, at least save the knight. Rook goes to d2. My rook goes to f8. Now almost every move wins for white. You don't need too much time to think about it. Rook goes to d8, and we exchange rooks. That exchange brings my opponent near the win. King goes to h7. Queen goes to c7, attacking both pawns at b7 and f7. My pawn goes to b5. Queen goes to b6. Pawn goes to g5. Queen grabs my pawn on a6. My knight goes to d5. I'm going to explain the moves because or even though they were not making too much sense. Queen goes to c6, and I was so nervous that I didn't even record them correctly, so I'm trying to understand what exactly was happening. Queen went to c6. Knight goes to b6. Queen grabs a pawn. The moves now were written wrong. I need to say that my knight did not go to b6. It went to... I'm not even sure where it went because I was so nervous at the time. I didn't even record the moves correctly. Try to guess where it could have gone. It was on d5. Most likely it went to b4. No, I think it went. Let's give a look. It went to b6. Queen takes a pawn. My knight goes to... And from here on, I really, although I have the score sheet in front of me, I'd rather not continuing with the moves because I wrote them wrong. I was so nervous at the time. I knew that from almost sure winning because of my carelessness, I had lost a game. And then after a few moves, I did something else that I regret. I thought that there was an error in the way things had been played, especially I couldn't believe that I had left my queen hanging. So I stopped the clock and asked the arbiter to come and check what had happened. We went again through all the moves, and what turned out to be the case is that the game had been played correctly, and I had an error in one of my notations. At that time, I was so embarrassed, not only because of what they have done, but asking the arbiter to come for a case that I was in the wrong. So I resigned the game. And even though I'm not sure the game until the end, there were three or four other moves that were played. It's move number 42. After move 46, I asked the arbiter to come and check what has happened. It turned out that the moves had been played correctly. My queen was really set loose, and there had been an error in my notation that had made me think that perhaps that was not the case. And I lost the second game because of an, I would say, not a chess error, but error in how to face a game. I was so excited with my opponent running out of time that instead of looking at the board, I was looking at his clock. At this point, we are going to go to the review of the game, although it's not exact because I have not shown all the moves until the end, but it doesn't make any difference. From now on, the moves are irrelevant. Let's see what the computer thinks. The computer thinks that white had 78.9%, I had 75.4. My opponent played for 1950, I played for 1700. I need to say that for the first 30 moves, I played quite well. I'm proud of how I played, but the move number 31 was the killer. So after this game, I had one win and one loss. Of course, I would like to congratulate my opponent, Evan Yuan, because in spite of him being at the end of his time and being in a very bad position, he continued attacking and he grabbed his opportunity when he had it. So this, for me, this is a sad story, but I'm not going to give up. I'm going to continue for with round number 3. In a few minutes, round number 3 was going to take place. But what happened in round number 3, you're going to see it at the next video. Lesson for all of us, always focus on the chessboard, not on the clock. Okay, one occasional look is fine to make sure that you're okay with the time, and clearly not on what is happening in the other boards. This is something I almost never do. Sometimes my opponents do it, and I ended up having an advantage. Let's see if I at least have learned my lesson. We'll see in the future if I make the same mistake again. One win and one loss, 1 point out of 2 in the first 2 rounds. One more round to go. I'm Harry Lausaniziris. This is my YouTube channel, grecochess. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the subscribers, to the viewers, to the likes. And for now, goodbye.